welcome to this session about Symfony. So Symfony started 10 years ago, actually, so we are celebrating the 10 years of Symfony this year. And a bit like Drupal, it started by being a one-man show. It was just me coding Symfony. It's a bit different from Dries, because at that time I was in a web agency called Sensio, and so I created Symfony not just for the fun of it, but because I needed something for my customers. Right? So Symfony was created because we needed to create good projects with PHP. And 2005 was the first release of PHP 5. So Symfony actually started as a PHP 5 only project, which means that from day one we were able to use all the nice features that come with PHP 5. So nowadays Symfony 2 is totally different from the project that I created 10 years ago. Symfony 1, version 1, was a totally different project. We started from scratch about 6 years ago, trying to learn about all our mistakes and all the things that we got wrong with the first version. And also because we realized that beside being a framework, Symfony has the potential to become a set of libraries that you can use independently. And that was the key point with Symfony 2, being able to give you developers a lot of independent components that you can use for your own projects. The second thing for Symfony 2 was trying to stick with best practices. And that's why we have an HTTP foundation and HTTP kernel components. The goal was really to try to stick to HTTP as much as possible, trying to not reinvent the wheel, trying to not have a Symfony way of doing things. That's also why we have dependency injection. That's why we have a dependency injection container. Symfony was actually the first framework in the PHP world to propose such a container. And again, it was not because it was fun, just because at some point we had so many different components that we needed a way to create the glue between all the components. And the only way to be able to do that in a decoupled way was to actually use dependency injection. And then to create a full stack framework, being able to configure all those services, having access to a container made things really easy. So I'm not going to talk too much about Symfony and the stories behind the framework, but nowadays, if you have a look at Packages, which is the website where all the Composer packages are referenced, Symfony and all its components have been downloaded millions of times already, which means that we have a great community of developers using the components. For open source projects like Drupal, so we have something like 50 different major PHP projects using one or more components coming from Symfony, but also for your private project, of course. And the fact that we are used, and Symfony is used by so many projects out there, means that we have a great responsibility. Right? A framework is the baseline. It is the foundation you are using to build something on top of it, and which means that we can't do bad things like breaking backward compatibility every other year, or so we need to have good practices there. We need to give you visibility on what's happening in the code, things like that. And I'm going to talk about this challenge and how we built a methodology and tools to help us be sure that we can guarantee backward compatibility between all the versions. The latest version of Symfony is 2.6. The next one is going to be 2.7 to be released at the end of the year, the month actually. So in a couple of weeks. weeks from now. 2.7 is just an evolution from 2.6, but we still have 100 new features, big and small, really. And I think the main point of Symfony 2.7 is performance, and some of the components were quite slow, and we worked out making sure that they are actually much faster than they used to be. And that's the case, for instance, for the translation component and a few other ones. We also work a lot on the serializer component, which is used by Drupal, so it's going to be super useful for you as well. Okay, so the first thing is we want predictability. If project depend on Symfony, you must know when a new version is coming out, so that you can plan ahead of time the migration to the new version. Which means that Symfony is not, the releases are not based on features, but on a date. So we know that the Symfony 2.7 version is going to be released by the end of the month, and I can tell you when the next version is going to be released as well, and the next 10 releases, as a matter of fact. And that's very important for private project, but that's also very, very useful for open source ones, which means that some projects, like Laravel, they try to sync their releases with Symfony so that they can upgrade from the current version they are using to the next one easily. So you know what to expect. If you want to have more information about our roadmap, you can go to symfony.com/roadmap. I think I'm going to switch to browser here. Okay. So here you can see. So this is a page. So the current version is okay. So the current version is actually 2.6, which is what we call a standard release. A standard release is maintained for a year, and 6 months after that for security issues. We also have long-term support releases, and the current one is 2.3, and an LTS is maintained for 3 years and 1 year for security issues, so 4 years in total. And the next LTS is going to be 2.7. And so if you want to know anything about a version, you can just type here the version, you can check, and we give you all the dates when it was released, the end of support for security fixes. Right? You can also get the same information as a JSON file, so that you can integrate that into your tools if that makes sense. Okay, this is the roadmap. And so, okay, I'm going to talk about this later on. So, we also have a backward compatible promise. So, there is a page on the symfony.com website. Okay, I'm going to switch from one window to the next one a lot here. So this page, not this one, symfony.com/bc. Right? And then we list exactly our rules regarding backward compatibility. So you can know exactly what to expect when you upgrade from one version to the next one. It's very detailed, so I'm not going to talk about everything here, but you can see all the use cases for classes, methods, interfaces, and so on. So we tell you what we can do with regular methods or API ones. I'm going to talk about the API later on. So I highly recommend you to read this document if you're working with Symfony, because it tells you everything you need to know about backward compatibility in the Symfony world. And by the way, it took us a lot of time to get to this point. So if you want to do the same things, you can probably just copy and paste what we've done here and adapt to your project. It's open source, so feel free to get inspiration from what we've done. So basically, we try to follow semantic versioning. and semantic versioning is easy to grasp, easy to understand, very difficult to actually make it work for a project. Right? It's always very easy to break backward compatibility in some ways in minor versions. So semantic versioning means that any 2.x+1 versions are compatible with the previous ones, 2.x. Right? It's not the case for the development versions, alpha versions, beta versions, release candidates, everything under the test directories. So all the tests, of course, we don't need to maintain backward compatibility. That's also not the case for any class or method tagged with @internal, right? And private stuff, obviously. So we do have some public methods tagged with internal just because of PHP limitation and the fact that we are still supporting PHP 5.3. So that's not going to be the case anymore in Symfony 3 because we're going to drop compatibility with older version of PHP. But right now we do have probably 10 methods that are public but really private. And anything public or protected can be a class, a property, a method, arguments, type ins, cannot be modified in any way. So if for any given set of input, we must have the same output, right? And that's the biggest problem that we are facing. And that's also why in Symfony we have a lot of private methods, a lot of them. By default, everything is private in Symfony. Protected and public are only when we want to provide an extension point. If not, everything is private. It makes our lives as maintainers it makes our life much easier because then we know that everything that is private, we can refactor it the way we want. And it helps a lot. And even for protected method, for instance, we need to be sure that we keep inheritance working the right way, which means that even if we deprecate a protected method, we still need to call it, because if you override a class with a protected method and you rely on this specific behavior, we need to keep it. So it's not, it can be a bit complex. So let me show you an example, a quick one here. Okay. Is it big enough? Yeah. So kernel here, we have an init method here. It has been deprecated in 2.3. And if you actually call this method, you will have a deprecation notice. I'm going to talk about this later on. But then we still call it here in the constructor, because if not, we are breaking backward compatibility. But as you can see, to be able to do that, it's a bit complex. It's not trivial. Because we need to be sure that when you create an init method in a class that extends kernel, you must have the deprecation notice. If not, you should not. So internally, we are calling the method, but we don't want to have the trigger. So it's not really interesting for developers using Symfony as a framework. It's very interesting to understand that it takes us a lot of time to maintain backward compatibility between all the releases. Okay, so here is another example. So simple stuff like moving things around. So we have this class which was part of HTTP kernel, but at some point we decided that it would have been better to actually move that to the debug component. And actually, when we created this class, the debug component did not exist. So we decided to move the namespace, but we keep backward compatibility. And if we have a look at the code, it's not that easy to get right. So if where is this? So this it's here. So this one is the old one, and if you call it directly, so if you instantiate this class directly, it's going to trigger the autoloading, and then you're going to have this trigger error method that is called, which is going to add a notice in your logs telling you that you can't use this method anymore because it is deprecated. And then it loads the new one. But if you have a look at the new one, it's here, but we extend this class which is defined here in the old namespace. And that's because we need to keep backward compatibility with type ins. So even if you added a type in for the old class, we need to make it work with the new namespace. So that's a lot of code that we need to add to make sure that whatever you're doing with the code, we do maintain backward compatibility. Okay, so 2.x plus 1 is compatible with 2.x, or 2.x minus 1 minus 2, etc. 3.0 can break backward compatibility, but what we are not doing is we do not add new features in 3.0 because there is no need to wait for 3.0 to actually add new features, which means that all the new features that you will have in 3.0 are actually already available in 2.x. So whenever we want to add a new feature, we add that in the 2.x branch. And of course, if this new feature means that we need to duplicate something, all the duplication notices are also part of the 2.x plus 1 version. So do not expect any new features in 3.0, as I said before. 3.0 is mainly the latest 2.x version minus all the deprecation notices and all the deprecated features, really. So, and also the compatibility layers, right? So it's more about cleaning the code than anything else. And we are breaking backward compatibility because we are removing this layer of compatibility. But of course, whenever possible, we try to keep backward compatibility between Symfony 2 and Symfony 3. So, Symfony 2.7, we thought it was the last version of Symfony 2, and actually it won't be. We are going to have an additional version for 2.x branch, which is going to be 2.8, and 2.8 is going to be released at the same time as 3.0 for a very simple reason. We want you to be able to wait until the next 3.x LTS version to upgrade from 2 point something to 3 point something else. If it's not clear, please interrupt me, ask any questions anytime. So let me recap. If you are using a Symfony standard version, you need to upgrade every 6 months. And we give you 6 months to upgrade. So you can upgrade every year, something like that. But sometimes you don't want to upgrade every 6 months. So we also have the LTS releases. We have one LTS release every 2 years, which means that we need to synchronize all the LTS releases, right? But the thing is, if 2.7 is the last LTS release and 3.2 is the next one, you won't have a year to upgrade, but just 6 months. Just because of that, we decided to add another LTS release for Symfony 2, which is going to be 2.8. That's the first reason. The second one is, if we didn't have this 2.8 release, it would have meant that the 2.7 release was the last time where we would have been able to add new features. Remember, we do not add new features in 3.0, which means that from now to November, we would not have been able to add any new features. And that's a big problem. So that's also why we added 2.8. So 2.8 and 3.0 are going to be released at the end of November this year. Same feature set. Big difference. 3.0 will have all the compatibility layer removed. So 2.8 is 3.0 plus the compatibility layers. Okay, so now we want to provide a very simple path of migration from 2.8 to 3.0. So how can we do that? So whenever we add a new feature, we add it in the changelog. So if you want to learn more about the new features, you can go to the changelog. We reference everything there. All the duplications are also part of the upgrade file. So that's how you can upgrade your project from one version to the next one, which means also that if you want to be compatible with 3.0, you can start to do it today. Just have a look at the upgrade file and do all the needed changes there. And we also add a deprecated tag with some commands about the new way of doing things in the code directly. So that's also something that you can have a look at. So in November, during the SymfonyCon in Madrid, we decided to add all those deprecation notices. Right? So it took us a lot of time. It took us about 3 months to add all the deprecation notices everywhere. So this is just one big pull request doing that, but we had many of them really. So the goal is that whenever you run your code, in the PHP logs, you have all the warnings telling you you can't use this method anymore because it is deprecated, so please use this other one or something like that. And of course, we got a lot of frustrated users because Symfony itself used deprecated stuff, right? So just by running Symfony itself on Hello World, just the unit test, we had more than 200,000 notices for Symfony itself. And that's why at some point people tried to get rid of all those notices. So the second step for us was to add an extension to PHP unit so that whenever we run the test, at the end of the test suite, you have a summary of all the duplicated stuff that you are using, right? And we started to update the code of Symfony to reduce those number of notices from 200,000 to 0 today. And it took a lot of time. This is one such commit. And then we realized that it was not enough. It was not enough because dynamic code is much more complex, and one such example is interfaces, for instance. So because we need to keep the type ints working for your code, we need to be able to load all those, we need to type int internally with deprecated interfaces, but we don't want to have the notices in this case. We only want the notice if you are using a deprecated interface. So we need to do that dynamically. So again, we added in the debug class loader of Symfony a check that actually warns you if you are using the interface and doesn't do anything if it is internal. So we have a lot of examples like that, and it took a lot of time for us to make the process work the right way. And then what we're going to change now is that we realized that adding all those notices at the end, so we added and we duplicated stuff since Symfony 2.3, so in 2.4, 2.5, 2.6, 2.7, it's really a nightmare to add all those notices after the fact. So for Symfony 2.8 and for any version of 3.x really, whenever we add a new feature, we will add the duplicated tag right away so that we don't have to do that in 2 or 3 years from now. And we also add a trigger notice in the code where appropriate. And of course, we enforce the fact that we should not and we must not use any duplicated stuff in Symfony. So 0 notices in Symfony itself and the Symfony components. Is it enough? Unfortunately, no. It's not enough because in your project you might use some of the components in the 2.3 version, some of them in the 2.6 version, and then some other ones in 3.0. Which means that we need to be sure that all those combinations can work, actually. So, but by default, Composer use the latest version of all the components in your requirement, right? right? So if you are using Symfony 2.7, you will get all the Symfony 2.7 dependencies. But in your composer.json file, you might say, I'm compatible with any version starting from Symfony 2.3. But how can you be sure that is still the truth? And the fact is, you can't really, because in Composer there was no way to do that. So what we want to be able to do is to say, okay, for any 2.x component, I want to check that it works for any other 2.x version of all the components that I'm using as dependencies here, and also with 3.0. And for 3.0, I want to make sure that it works for 3.0, of course, but also for 2.8. That way we can be sure that we are compatible all the way from 2.x to 3.0. So we added 2 new flags to Composer to make it work, prefer lowest and preferred stable. That way we can say whenever we are running the test, we are running the test for the lowest stable version, but also for the latest version that is not necessarily stable, right? And if you want to have a look at how it works, have a look at .travis.yaml file in Symfony. So we are testing on a lot of different versions of PHP, and then you can see an environment variable here, depth low or depth high. What it means is that in this case, I want to use the lowest versions possible. It also helps us upgrade our composer.json files because we realized that we were saying that we were compatible with this version of Symfony component A, but actually the code did not work. So we tweaked all the composer.json files to reflect the reality of the code and not just what we had a few years ago, really. Okay, so have a look at the code here. It's pretty straightforward, really. Okay, but then what about the tests themselves? Because, so in the 2.x versions, we deprecated stuff, but we still do have the test for them, of course, because we don't want to break stuff. But in 3.0, the code is not there anymore, which means that if we want to make the test run for all the versions, we need a way to say, okay, you can't run this test in 3.0 because the code is not there anymore, right? So what we had is we have a group legacy tag for all our duplicated tests. So whenever we have a test that is about something that is not relevant anymore, we add this group legacy tag to the test, which means that by default we exclude this group when running the test on Symfony 3.0. And you can see that on the Travis, in the Travis configuration, really. Is it clear enough? Yeah? I'm sure. Okay, so that's how we can make sure in the code that things work the way they need to work, really. And then we can guarantee that because the core team makes sure that you are doing the right thing, you are adding the duplicated stuff whenever it is needed. We check with Travis that we don't break unit test. So we have a lot of tools and methodology to make sure that we actually have backward compatibility between all the versions. Okay, so it was the first step. It's done now with Symfony 2.7. But then, what about the ecosystem? So what about your code? What about open source libraries using Symfony? Right. And the thing is, you must do the exact same thing that we are doing if you want to be sure that you will be able to upgrade from Symfony 2.6 to Symfony 3.0. So we did the work with some of the main Symfony bundles and libraries, really. So we fixed all the deprecation notices and we enabled the test on Symfony 3.0. So I highly recommend you that you are doing the same with Drupal, just to see what you are using today and if you are not using too many deprecated features. And the good news is that you can migrate today to be sure that you don't have any notices. That's totally possible. It's even easier for you because you can break backward compatibility, right? On Drupal 2.8, 8, Drupal 8, you can still break BC or not? Yeah, somehow. Okay, so do that on Friday during the sprints. I can help you if you need to. To make it easy, we also published a PHP unit bridge that automates a lot of what I've just talked about. And again, it took months for us to get it right, so you might want to reuse what we've done. Oops, sorry. So the way it works is that you just require the Symfony/PHP unit-bridge library in your composer.json file in the require-dev section, and then it's going to be enabled whenever you run PHP unit. Right. So that's how we have. Oh, okay. I haven't shown you that. It's interesting. So if you go on not this window, but this one, if you go on Travis Symfony. Okay, you can see at the end of the run, you have this line here, and it says that we have this many deprecation notices, which is fine because we are actually testing old stuff. But if those deprecation notices were coming from code that is not deprecated, you would have a warning and the test would have been read, right, to be sure that we never ever merge a pull request with such a problem. I don't think that I have an example here because we are very strict now about that, but let's have a look at this one, for instance. No, that's something different. That's something different. Anyway, okay. Okay, so this is the methodology that you can take for your own project if you depend on Symfony. You can read the upgrade file. So you need to read all the upgrades files from all the versions of Symfony really to upgrade your code. So starting from 2.3. You must not ignore any notices. That's why we have the PHP unit bridge. Of course, you need tests on your code to make it work. If you do not have tests for some features, we won't be able to tell you that you have problems. One thing is that we cannot give you any information about deprecated constants, and we have some of them, these ones, so I'm not sure if you are using those. You should not, but those should be done by hand. And also, I think there is the same problem with Drupal. The very first request is very different from the next ones, right? Because during the very first request, we warm up the cache, which means that we are running some code that won't run anymore for all the other requests, right? So you need to be careful to actually check all the notices coming from this very first request when the cache is actually warmed up, right? If not, you're going to have some problems. PHP Storm is also a good IDE because it catches all the deprecated tags, which means that within the IDE it's going to tell you that you are using something that is obsolete, really. So that's also a good way to spot problems and to easily upgrade those problems. Last but not the least, as we are triggering duplicated notices, you should exclude them on your production servers, because at first you might have thousands of such notices. So if you enable them in production, you're going to have a lot of notices in the logs. It can be a problem, so you can fill up your disk pretty fast. So at first, disable that on your production servers, enable that only in your staging or development or testing environments. Okay, so then I'm just going to talk about this slide, for instance, which is about Twig, because we are also duplicating a lot of stuff in Twig. The most important ones are the two first ones for Drupal. The first one is the render tag. The second one is the include tag. I'm not sure if you are using them. I haven't checked recently. But if you are doing that, you must replace them with the functions, and the names are exactly the same. So for the render tag, you must choose the render function, and for the include tag, you must choose the include function. So just use grep hack. It's really easy to make the change here. The class loader. So again, you must upgrade to the latest versions of the classes. So we've done that way back in the past. So it should be easy to upgrade from the old one to the new one. It's mainly about renaming of the classes, and that's all. Dependency injection. So Drupal is using dependency injection in the container coming from Symfony a lot. Scopes are going to be removed from Symfony 3.0 because we don't need them anymore. It was a big mistake to actually introduce them in the first place. We were mainly using it for the request, but it was the problem was not that we did not have the right way to manage the request in the DIC. It was just because adding the request as a service was a big mistake. A request, an HTTP request, is actually not a service. So in Symfony, starting from Symfony 2.4, I don't remember, 4, I think, yeah, 2.4, instead of the request service, you must use the request stack service where, and this is a service that gives you access to the current request, or the parent one if you are using stacked requests, really. And synchronized is also duplicated because it was added again just because we add request as a service. And that's an interesting story by itself. Just because we did this big mistake of defining the request as a service, we added a bunch of features in a container just to be able to deal with this mistake. It took us, a lot of time adding those crazy stuff, the scopes and synchronized, and actually it was really a nightmare to maintain. And we have so many edge cases and stuff going on, really. And then we just realized that, the request is not a service. Bam! Everything was really easier, and we can remove so many lines of code from Symfony just because we did this mistake. And the last one is about factories. So the way we configure factories is a bit different now. It was not a big deal, but it was mostly because now we have more flexibility with the new way of defining the factories. So again, this change in the configuration should not be difficult to change in your code and in Drupal code. Are you using synchronized, the synchronized feature in Drupal? At some point, I know that you were using that, but I'm not sure if it's the case anymore. Not anymore. Okay. Okay, cool. And you're not using scopes anymore. Okay, that's great. That's great news. Small changes in routing. We renamed pattern to path because it makes more sense. We also removed, we had specialized routing classes for Apache, and the goal was to make it really fast or faster when you are using Apache. But at some point we realized that those classes made the routing stuff slower, actually, instead of faster, because of caching problems and stuff, whatever. So they are removed from Symfony 3.0. In the console, okay, so here it's mainly about refactoring mistakes that we did, and we actually made a lot of mistakes, so we are trying to fix them step by step, which takes time because we need to maintain backward compatibility. So again, it's mainly about best practices here. For the event dispatcher, we've removed those methods mainly because they are not that useful, and it makes the event dispatcher slower, so that's why we removed them. We removed the logger interface from HTTP kernel because back then PSR 4? Don't remember. 3? 4? PSR about the logging stuff did not exist. It exists, so we can remove that now. I've talked about init and stuff. Okay, everything else is really not that interesting. Okay, the serializer, we removed those methods because they did not really make sense. They were not available in the interfaces anyway, so we now have exceptions everywhere, so you don't have to fall back to this weird PHP mechanism of dealing with errors, really. And that's it. So let's do it. If you need any help upgrading Drupal for Symfony 2.7, please don't hesitate. We are here to help. And if you want to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of Symfony, you can come to the SymfonyCon Paris conference. It's going to be at the beginning of December this year. It's going to be at the Folies Bergère, which is a very well-known theater in Paris. We expect more than 1,000 people there, so it's going to be fun. And that's all for today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Yeah. Uh-huh. So the thing is, I think we never actually talked about using this mechanism. Probably because we did not have that many use cases where it would have been helpful, really. So in Symfony, we try to standardize on one way of doing things as much as possible. And I think the number of use cases where it would have been interesting, it was just not enough.